This lesson examines the account of events leading up to the Great Flood and one incident shortly after. That's Genesis 6 through 9. And you can see on the screen here we're showing the parallel Septuagint on the left there and the Masoretic text on the right. There are a number of other links in the description that we'll want to check out, and I'll mention those as we go along. Genesis 6 is where we first encounter the term sons of God. And I'm not going to read through the text today very much at all and just let you look at that in whatever version you choose. But the sons of God is a problematic statement because people don't agree on what that means. Most people seem to approach the text with the presumption that this cannot refer to angels based on 2 points. One, that angels aren't physical, so they can't mate with people. And the statement Jesus made in Matthew 22:30 that marriage will no longer apply to the dead because they will be like the angels in heaven. The claim that spirit beings cannot be physical is refuted by Genesis 18, where Abraham is visited by what appeared to be 3 men who ate and drank with him. The context clearly indicates that these men were really God in what is called a theophany, an appearance of God. God has no physical form, and Jesus would not incarnate for thousands of years after this. So someone may object that God can only do this and not angels, but Hebrews 13:2 says that some have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. To this we could add the account of Balaam in Numbers 22, where God allowed him to see the angel blocking his way, or Luke 24, where the women at Jesus' empty tomb saw 2 men who gleamed like lightning, or Genesis 19, where the men of Sodom wanted to rape the angels who came to rescue Lot, but referred to them as men. So they didn't seem to know that these were angels in any of these cases until they were told so. So that sons of God phrase in 6:2 has a lot of controversy around it. But the objection that angels cannot or would not take on physical form is simply not true by Scripture alone. The description also has a link to a good article on angels in the Bible if you want to pursue that in more detail. And it points out that though angels always appear to people as adult male humans, they're only doing so temporarily and for our benefit. The point is not that they're adult male humans, but that they can take on real physical flesh that can eat and drink as any human would. As for the other point referencing what Jesus said, he specified that the angels in heaven don't marry. Not the fallen angels, and not by inability, but by choice. He says they don't, not that they can't. And someone may think that these are trifling details, but they're important nonetheless when the issue is, does the text say, did Jesus say that no angelic beings are able to marry? It doesn't say that. And we might wonder why this is even an issue until we remember the serpent seed theory. The presumption that no angelic being could mate with humans leads to what is called the Sethite Theory, which developed in the 5th century AD. This theory claims that while the line of Cain was wicked, the line of Seth was righteous. So they equate sons of God with the Sethites and daughters of men with the Cainites, not to be confused with Canaanites. These are the children of Cain, or the line of Cain. But this theory is based on nothing but presumption and poor logic. For example, why would only the daughters of Cain be wicked and the sons of Seth be righteous? Why would the children of such unions result in what Genesis 6 describes as giants, who were renowned from ancient times? This is speaking from Moses' perspective. And why would Jude later describe the fallen angels as having left their proper place and chased after, quote, strange flesh? The ancient myths of godlike beings, some apparently part animal, likely came from these hybrid offspring of the fallen angels and human women. And when they died, being part angel, they could not go to the grave as human souls did, but would wander the earth and become known, in my opinion, as demons. This might also explain why demons seem to crave taking over the body of a person or even an animal, and sometimes inanimate objects. At least the argument for sons of God being angels has some support in Scripture and history. And these questions about why only the sons of Seth would be righteous and the daughters of Cain wicked are questions that are pretty tough to answer if we want to adopt that theory. So there is biblical and logical support for the fact that these sons of God could indeed be angelic beings, and it's not likely that they were mere humans. In verses 5 through 7 and also 11 and 12, if I would scroll down to that in a minute, we see the reasons God decided to flood the earth. Everyone's mind was continually focused on evil, and the earth was filled with corruption. Now, the Septuagint has a word meaning sin in verse 11, and let me scroll down to see that. Corrupted, and the earth was filled with iniquity, which is another, one of the many Greek words for sin. But the Masoretic text has a word for violence, that violence was the reason, not simply sin. But violence is only one kind of sin. And what does it mean that Noah was found to be perfect in his generation per verse 9? So I think I still have that on the screen. We'll roll up a little bit. What does that mean? Some say that it means he was the only good person of his generation, his time, but generations overlap, and all the rest of mankind was wiped out in the flood. So it couldn't just be referring to his particular generation, because more than one generation would be alive at the time, and they were all wiped out. So others say that it means he was genetically pure, having no mixture with the fallen angels. And this idea, I think, fits better with the context regarding giants and men of renown. Now, to the building of the ark. You can check a description link for the website dedicated to studying the dimensions and seaworthiness of the ark itself, and I would encourage you to do that. Keep in mind that the ark was not built for speed or distance, but simply to stay afloat in rough seas. That's all it was supposed to do, was keep everybody dry. There's no problem fitting the pairs of animals on board either, and we can't assume all of them were fully grown at the time. Although a year is plenty of time for most animals to mature, they didn't have to be their full adult size when they started and wouldn't require as much food, for example. So there's no problem. People have calculated how many animals would have been on the ark and how much food they would need, how much space it would take, and you can look into that at the description link, but we can rest assured it was not as the cartoon version has it, where there are giraffe necks sticking out the windows and so forth. So keep in mind also that there wouldn't need to be every variation within a kind on board. For example, one pair of wolves could result in all kinds of what we call dogs without requiring millions of years. And compared to the evolutionary fable about life arising from electrified pond scum, the Bible's account is much more believable. It's not irrational at all, especially compared to alternative theories of how this would happen. That even secular science has traced back human history to what they call a bottleneck to about 8 people. Interestingly enough, that's how many the Bible says were on the ark. And that this is perfectly plausible, and we have flood stories in all the ancient society, all their ancient histories, and many copies imply an original. When all the different cultures have a very similar story, the odds are that that story was real. And so we have certain essential elements, such as a great flood, a boat, 8 people surviving, and this tells you that this event is a real historical event. So it is not something the Bible made up. And it didn't borrow it from some other culture. They all are accounts of the same event. Now, you can go ahead and read the rest of chapter 6. It's kind of repetitive, for whatever reason, about the animals getting on the ark and so forth. So let's go on to chapter 7. And this is where God finally tells Noah to enter the ark along with his wife, his 3 sons, and all of their wives. As for mention of the clean animals, remember that once again that Moses is using the word clean during a time when such a term had meaning. When Moses is writing this stuff, people knew what clean animals were, and he's just using that later descriptive word. It doesn't mean that Noah knew they were clean or called them clean. All the preparation likely took place, for getting all the animals together and getting them on the ark, probably during the 120 years that God marked out back in chapter 6, verse 3, where God said, I will not always strive with man, his years will be 120. Some people will say that's the lifespan, but that really doesn't add up. It doesn't, isn't what we observe in the text later on a regular basis. It most likely means that from the time God decided to do this to the time the flood would actually happen was 120 years, and that's when all this preparation took place. But here in chapter 7, we see that they're told that the rains will come in 7 days when Noah was 600 years old. So Noah had been around a while, and yet he's told, okay, now there's been 120 years since I told you this was going to happen. Now there's going to be only 7 days. Verse 11, let's scroll down to that, states that the fountains of the abyss were broken up, or the great deep. That's what abyss means. And the torrents, or the floodgates to release them. A torrent is like a waterfall, a sudden gush of water. That this abyss from below and the waters above the sky were let loose. The traditional interpretation is that torrents of the sky simply refers to rain, but we can't rule out a supernatural release of at least some of the waters above the sky per Genesis 1. The objection to this view is that there could not possibly be waters coming from beyond the stars to the earth. Yet who is to say that the stars are that big and far away? The Bible certainly doesn't say that. And few are aware of just how much guesswork and imagination goes into what is passed off as the science of cosmology or astronomy. It's an awful lot of presumption and guessing and storytelling and artwork. And we should ponder the question of how the surface of a ball could flood anyway. People, especially atheists and evolutionists, have always mocked the idea of a global flood. So why should we believe as Christians that this happened when the Bible doesn't say the earth is a ball, and it says that waters came from the sky and the windows of heaven? The Masoretic puts it as windows of heaven. Floodgates is more accurate of a description, I think, to let the water above loose. And again, we will see the same problem with cosmological models and when we eventually get to Revelation, where it says that the stars of the sky fell to earth, like when a fig tree casts its fruit early because it's shaken by a strong wind. We have to reinterpret and allegorize and say, well, they didn't know what meteors and asteroids were, but I think they did. I think they knew an awful lot about the sky. And in Greek, at least, there really doesn't seem to be separate words for various space bodies, so-called. They're all called stars. Aster, that's where we get the word astronomy. And planets, as I think I mentioned in an earlier lesson, are simply wandering stars. So there is no reason we must accept what is considered scientific fact when the real fact is that it's a lot of storytelling and assumptions and trying to triangulate, for example, the distance of a star that is so far away that no amount of Earth orbit around the sun can even begin to triangulate the thing. But they tell us they know exactly how far away these things are, and then they extrapolate from there how big they are. They don't know. There are too many unknown variables in the formula to even make a good guess. So keep that all in mind when reading the story about the flood. And now we'll go down to verse 19 for the rest of that chapter. And verse 19 states that the ark was lifted by the waters over the tops of the highest mountains, though we can't be sure how the mountain sizes compared to the mountains as we know them today. Since the waters below ground were released by the ground being broken up, or the abyss being broken up, whatever that means, the landmass and everything on it was likely to be changed in very significant ways. A lot of upheaval and turmoil would have certainly gone on with that. So the fossil record and the layers of strata in which they're found are best explained by the process of floods, including the rapid deposition of silt and other debris. Smaller creatures would be the first to die, while larger ones could get to higher ground at first, explaining why smaller, simpler creatures are found in the lower rock strata. Now, flood geology is a much more straightforward explanation of what we observe, in my opinion, than any gradualistic story. You might notice also that these rock layers have very sharp lines between them that makes you wonder what happened to suddenly change. If this was all gradual, it'd be like a graduated, from color from, or say from white to black, going through shades of gray. There are no sharp lines in such a gradient. We don't have gradients. We have sharp lines marking different layers. How can that be gradualistic? It just doesn't make any sense. But the issue of flood aftermath and why evolution is a fable are beyond the scope of this lesson, so please visit the link in the description about that. Also visit the YouTube channel mentioned there called Wise Up that shows evidence of a level of technology wiped out by the flood, which, of course, was the flood's purpose. That's the reason God flooded the earth, is to wipe stuff out, not to preserve it. And what that channel does is explain with, a knowledgeable person who knows about building and construction and pouring concrete and rebar and wood structures and what would happen to these things during and after the flood. It makes a lot of sense, so you should check that out. Much of what we have been told is alien rock cutting or people wearing out simple copper tools to carve rocks with great skill, amazing skill, is really just wood, straw, concrete, metal, and other materials being buried under salt water for a year or more while the earth went through violent changes. And of course, it would take time after that for the floodwaters to recede, and with them would come a lot of silt and things, and plant debris and all sorts of things being shifted all over the place. And these things will mineralize anything in their path, and over time this would, the organic parts would rot away or rust away. They had metal, and there's evidence that they could pour concrete. A lot of the rocks that look like they were melted are really just bags that people probably put up to try to guard against the oncoming floodwaters. And of course, they were buried, they were drowned in the water, and they would mineralize, and then they looked like bags that were filled with sand or something that got mineralized and turned to rock. That's why they look melted. This is basically the theory there at the Wise Up channel. Now let's go on to chapter 8. Let me go up and get that on the screen. And chapter 8 reports on the end of the Great Flood, which, according to verse 13, lasted about a year. Noah then built an altar to God and sacrificed some of the clean animals. And again, remember what we said about clean. This is where God made the first covenant or promise, and you may recall the chart of biblical covenants in the overview lesson. And here God promises to Noah, really to all life forms that survive, that he will never again wipe out the earth with water. Though in 2 Peter 3:7, he will wipe it out in the future with fire. Until then, God promised that the seasons will continue. That's what we see here in chapter 8. And I don't need to go into detail about how Noah tested whether or not once the ark came to rest, he tested whether or not it was safe to go out, and eventually, you can read that story about how eventually they all left the ark. Then in chapter 9, it explains why animals seem to have a natural fear of people, and that being because God commanded it. Well, why? Why would God do that? But we'll read in verse 3 that the animals themselves will become food for humans. So that's probably why. That would be my guess. And it says there that just as God had given all the green herbs or plants as food, he now gives meat. And keep in mind that God is blessing Noah, and the eating of meat is part of that blessing. God blessed Adam and Eve by saying you can eat all these plants, and now he's blessing Noah, saying you can eat the animals too. And he further commands that if anyone, human or animal, takes a person's life, that human or animal must pay with its own life. That's God's rule. And as God's habit is throughout the scriptures, he puts a seal on his covenant, and this particular one is the seal or sign of the rainbow. And I think that's down here a little bit. Yeah, this is verse 12. This is the sign of the covenant. I will set my bow in the cloud, verse 13. And then we go down to verse 20 and see the incident with Noah and his son Ham. Some commentators interpret the incident to mean that Ham actually violated the naked body of his drunken father, while others only take what's actually stated in the text, though they point out that an accidental glimpse of his father's body would not in itself be sinful. Rather, they think it's reasonable to infer that Ham went out and mocked his father to his brothers. That is to say, he thought it was funny that he caught his drunken father naked in his tent, and so he went out and told his brothers and laughed about it. Because there seems to be more here than just simply accidentally seeing this, that Ham added to his sin by going out and mocking his own father. So we might ask, though, why it is that when Noah became sober and found out what had happened, that he didn't curse Ham himself, he cursed his son Canaan. Scripture doesn't tell us, but maybe, perhaps it was because the son of Noah, Canaan, would suffer the experience of having, or not, I mean Ham is the son of Noah, who humiliated his father, and maybe the point was that Canaan would humiliate Ham. I don't know. I'm just guessing, and that's all anybody can do. But it might explain why it is that Ham's son would suffer the curse of Noah rather than Ham himself. And that's pretty much the end of chapter 9. We're going to get into genealogies and the spreading out of the nations, and I think I'll save that for a separate lesson, even though this one was on the short side, but that's okay. I think it's a good breaking point. So this completes the lesson about the Great Flood, what led up to it, and why it's a perfectly rational thing to believe the biblical account. And next will come a study of the earliest post-flood genealogies, including some interesting names that will appear later in Bible prophecy, such as names like Magog. So check out the resources we have, not only our usual interlinear of the Septuagint, that's also linked again starting with chapter 6. We have also a link comparing the Masoretic text to the Septuagint. We have this parallel that we're looking at. We have the link about angels in the Bible, a link about the seaworthiness of the ark, as I mentioned, a site called Science Against Evolution, which is a really good go-to site for anything to do with evolution that is debunked by science alone. And the Bible is not invoked unless someone, a critic writing into the website, brings it up. So it's, the design is extremely simple and outdated. It was done, it looks like it was done in the 80s or 90s, and the website owner is happy with that. It works on everybody's devices. So don't judge a book by its cover. It's got excellent content. And of course, we have the link to the YouTube channel Wise Up that I mentioned as well, for evidence of pre-flood technology, which was probably very similar to our own at this point, maybe a little more advanced, but not a whole lot. But it makes sense of a lot of things. So there's a lot of material, and I'm just trying to give you websites links and video links so that you can learn more. There's too much for one person to present, and I'm just trying to tell you where you can find some of these things to get you started. So that's it for the lead up to the flood itself, and just after Noah gets off the ark. There's not really a time span given here in chapter 9 about when this incident with Ham happened. But there was time for Noah to plant crops and grow vines and things like that. So maybe a few years, we don't know, but not a long time. But they do give the age of Noah when he finally did die, which is 950 years. So the flood happened when he was 600 years old. It ended when he was 601. So the incident with Ham might have happened when he was 602 or 3. And then he lived another 300 and almost 350 years after that. So his three sons are not just Ham, but also Shem and Japheth, and we'll find out more about them. The names are a little bit different in Greek, but we'll stick with the familiar English names and minimize confusion. But you can read what the names actually were, and names from that far in antiquity, at least back to the time of Moses. Moses would have had correct names as far as matters, but we don't know, we don't have the original Moses writings in Paleo Hebrew or whatever it was, or Proto-Sinaitic or whatever. But the Septuagint is probably closer to the actual, at least the sound of the names. So we'll learn more about what happens with Noah's sons in the next lesson.